Hello there, I'm Rob Caskie, Engaging Storytelling, and I hope you're enjoying the stories that I'm sharing on Patreon. One of the great stories in South African folklore is that of a game ranger called Harry Wolhuter, who was able to kill a lion with a knife in the Kruger National Park. And we need to go back perhaps just a little here to the late 1890s when the president of the Transvaal Republic, Stephanus Johannes Paulus Creer, Paul Kruger, Oom Paul, everyone called him, realized that if this hunting, particularly of the prey and the meat species in Mpumalanga, in the Eastern Transvaal, continued unabated, that we would end up with no animals in that part of the world at all. The area was heavily hunted on account of the transport riders coming up from Lorenzo Marx up over the escarpment to supply the goldfields of the Witwatersrand. And it was at that time that the Sabi Sand Game Reserve was created, the old initial Sabi Game Reserve that became the nucleus of the Kruger National Park and remains perhaps to this day one of the most game-rich areas in South Africa. A remarkable man was the warden of the Kruger National Park, Stevenson Hamilton, and he had with him a number of game rangers who were, in my opinion, as tough as they come. One of them was a man called Harry Wolhuter, and the legend always was that you give Harry Wolhuter some food rations and a rifle and supply him with a horse, and he'll be ready to take off anywhere at a few hours' notice. And Harry Wolhuter at that time was tasked, as many of the game rangers were, to eliminate the predators, the lions particularly, the leopard, the hyena, the wild dog, because those predators, in terms of their food requirements, were knocking back the numbers of the prey species, the antelope species, which had been hammered by the transport riders and their staff, which was exactly what Paul Kruger was trying to reverse. And to build up the numbers of the prey species, he had to eliminate the numbers of the predators. And Harry Wolhuter was out on a patrol with some of his policemen. The policemen were on foot leading donkeys on which the supplies were carried for their camping trip and their patrol. Harry Wolhuter was riding a horse, and he had with him two of his dogs, a big, strong dog called Bull and a smaller crossbred terrier type. And the standard procedure was to camp at night, where they would cut a scarum or a barricade of thorn bushes and camp within that screen of thorn bushes to protect their donkeys and themselves largely from the attentions of lions. And they were in the area of what is now the Central Kruger National Park. I have here a guidebook of the Kruger National Park, and on the cover are two lions, which are certainly not the lions involved in my story, but could just as easily be, because there were two big male lions involved in our story. And Harry Wolhuter and his team of policemen got to a waterhole where they expected to find water and camp. The waterhole was bone dry. They were left with no option. At the end of the day, extremely thirsty, they hadn't had a drink in hours, to proceed another 8 miles, 12 kilometers to the next waterhole. Harry Wolhuter, his horse and his two dogs would ride on ahead, and the policemen would follow behind with the donkeys. Well, it very soon got dark. And Harry Wolhuter, on his path towards that next waterhole, said the country he was riding through had been burnt out, leaving small patches of unburned vegetation. And in the dark, animals would often run out of the patches of unburned vegetation, which he assumed were reedbuck, which were quite common in that area. Well, in the dark, he heard animals rushing in the dark and realized very quickly that they were not running away from him, but running towards him. And in the few seconds that followed, a mighty weight crashed onto the back of his horse. It was a large male lion, which had sunk its claws into the hindquarters of his horse, and his horse began to buck and rear wildly, as these poor creatures would. Wolhuter was immediately aware that there was another lion running alongside of his horse in an attempt to get hold of his horse's throat. And in the bucking and the rearing of his horse, Harry Wolhuter was unsaddled and landed on top of the second lion, the animal that indeed was going for his horse's throat. Well, the horse took off with the second lion after it, and bull and the dog in hot pursuit, whilst the lion that had been running alongside of his horse immediately grabbed Harry Wolhuter by the right shoulder and began to drag him away. Now, there are a number of things to consider here. The first is the pain. You know, Wolhuter always claimed that David Livingstone maintained that at times of great shock, he in fact was attacked by a lion once and said he felt no pain on account of the shock. Wolhuter said he disagreed with that theory and that point most strongly, because he said the pain was excruciating. To add to it, he had boots on, and on the heels of the boots he had spurs on account of riding the horse. And as the lion was dragging him along, the spurs would hook in the dry ground, and the lion would give him a violent jerk to get him moving again. To add to all this, Harry Wolhuter is now lying between the lion's forelegs, being dragged effectively on his back and his buttocks. The dew claws on the lion's front legs and the dew claws on the lion's rear legs are tearing at his forearms and the tendons at the wrists, and indeed on his calves and down towards his ankles. And he said the smell, as his face was pushed up into the mane of this lion, was just unbearable. And to add to the indignity of it all, he said the lion was purring, which he said sounded like a big V8 engine rumbling at idle. Now, Harry Wolhuter, as rangers would, used to carry a knife on his belt. Now, the knife was carried on his right hip, and the knife that he had was a pirate or a copy of a famous knife made in Sheffield in England called the Pike brand knife. Now, the Pike brand at the time was to most considered to be the Rolls-Royce of knives. And Harry Wolhuter one day was at a trading post at Leidenburg, and on the counter at the trading post was a board on which was a piece of cheese and a knife to cut the cheese, provided by the owner of the trading store. And Harry Wolhuter saw that the knife on that cheese board was indeed a Pike brand knife. Now, the Pike brand and his knife looked pretty much identical. And Wolhuter, I think, was an extremely honest man, said he never felt comfortable or good about it, but he decided to swap the knives around, that he would have a genuine Pike brand knife. And that Pike brand knife fitted rather loosely in the sheath in which he used to carry it on his belt. And as Harry Wolhuter is being dragged along by the lion with his violent jerks, as his spurs hooked in the dry ground, thought about the knife on his belt. But he remembered that that knife fitted loosely in the sheath and may well have flown out of the sheath on account of the fall from the horse. Now, Harry Wolhuter was very aware at this time that he could not allow the lion to know that he was alive, because if it did, it may well drop him and grab him by the head, and that would certainly be the end of his life. So Harry Wolhuter now begins with his left hand to feel very, very carefully across his front, between his body and the lion, down towards his right hip, praying that the knife was still there. And I need to give you a little aside here, if I may, because quite often I'm lucky enough to speak about the role of intuition in our lives and in our businesses, and how important it is to listen to that intuition, your gut feeling, your third eye, your pineal gland, whatever you want to call it. And in the modern world, particularly with fluoride in our water, it tends to calcify and harden the pineal gland that sits between your left and right brain lobe. And it's that pineal gland or third eye that provides us with what we call intuition. Now, Harry Wolhuter in this predator eradication program had, I believe, realized that one day his knowledge of the physiology of a lion may well save him. And he had taken very careful note of the physiology of a lion and knew exactly where its vital organs were, particularly its heart and its lungs. Back to our story. Can you imagine the relief when his left hand gets around without the line seemingly noticing, to his right hip, and his hand closes around the handle of his beloved Pike brand knife. He pulls that knife from the sheath on his belt, and he now is being dragged along on his back and his buttocks by the line with the regular jerks to free the spurs, and he would reach up behind the lion's left shoulder and feel ever so carefully along the rib cage with his little finger for the ribs, knowing that with his off arm, in a reverse thrust, he had almost no power, and that if the knife struck a rib, it would certainly be unsuccessful. And he was determined to try and strike the lion into the heart between the second and the third rib. Now I want you to imagine the desperation of the scene as he feels back across the second and the third rib, and then back a little so he's got the space in between. And then with 2 strokes, as hard as he could, he plunges his knife hopefully into the heart of the lion, and then upwards directly above him, hoping to hit the jugular vein of the lion. Well, he was successful, because blood immediately spurted out of the jugular vein of the lion all over him. The lion dropped him, coughing, making the most terrible sounds, and rushed off. And Wolhuter realized that the other lion, which had been pursued by his dogs in pursuit of the horse, may well be back for him, and that he better get off the ground as soon as he could. And in the dark, he fumbled around, looking around, trying to find a tree that he could climb, bearing in mind the damage I've already explained to his wrists and the tendons in his arms and his legs, and he's covered with blood, with the pain and this absolutely debilitating shoulder injury. Well, he finds a tree that he felt had a bough low enough for him to grab on to begin to climb the tree, and he pulled himself up into this tree with tremendous difficulty. He then undoes his leather belt and does it up around the tree to keep him in the tree, realizing that he is about to faint and pass out from the shock and the horror of it all and the loss of blood. It was at this point that the other lion arrived back at the base of the tree and was determined to climb up to him. He wasn't very far off the ground. He was horrified that, having escaped the jaws of the first, that he might end up as dinner for the second. Well, his beloved dog Bull was harassing the lion, stopping it from climbing the tree, and the lion would turn and rush at Bull and then rush back to the tree in an attempt to climb up to Wolhuter. Well, Wolhuter, during all this, could hear the lion he'd stabbed coughing its last, its death throes and that horrible death rustle as it died. And the dog, bless the dog, managed to keep the lion from climbing the tree. Wolhuter said as the night wore on, he became aware of just how cold he was. It was a cold winter night. It was mid-year, and he's covered in blood, his own and the lion's, sopping wet, and now in that frigid winter night is about to die of exposure. And it wasn't long before he heard the approach of his policemen. He shouted to them to be aware that there was a lion nearby. Well, in the dark, they were very unhappy about that and immediately began to set alight to any vegetation they could find that would burn, and began to bang pots and make as much noise as possible. And they got up to Harry in the tree, and they began to extract him and get him down from the tree. He said the pain was simply unbelievable because the wounds now had stiffened, and he said the difficulty with which I was extracted from the tree would be impossible to describe. His policemen in the meantime decide that they're going to quickly skin the lion that he'd killed and remove the skull, because they believe that a concoction made up with boiling the skull of the lion is the best treatment for lion bite or lion wounds. Well, Wolhuter would later say that he's adamant that the septicemia, which nearly took his life, was definitely attributable to this concoction with which the policemen, in their faith and in their Shangaan ways, had treated him. And they made a machilla where you take 2 poles or pieces of wood, and in between you stretch a blanket, and they carried Wolhuter on the blanket to the next waterhole, which was indeed the object of their walk that night, to find the waterhole absolutely dry. There was a little bit of mud. Wolhuter said what I would have paid that night for a glass of fresh, cool water is inestimable. Well, his policeman carried that remarkable man for another 4 days. Wolhuter said the smell from my shoulder was so bad that I had to turn my head the other way. By the time they got him to a ranger post and were able to transport him to hospital, it was a good 5 or 6 days after the event of the attack. The doctors were adamant that Wolhuter would die. So bad was the septicemia, never mind the damage to his shoulder. He was praying, of course, to live, firstly, and secondly, that he would still be able to lift his right hand high enough to fire a rifle. Well, Harry Wolhuter was lucky enough to survive. I think an iron constitution, being incredibly fit and slim and young and strong, helped to save him. He was able to lift his hand high enough to fire a rifle and continued with his work as a ranger. The horse was so traumatized by this attack that it was useless as a riding horse thereafter, because Wolhuter said if a duiker or a rabbit sprang up nearby and took off, the horse would shy and bolt in the most violent of fashions, which was unfortunate. It was left with horrible scars in its hindquarters, but it was fortunate enough to get away from the horse and live. Now that skin from the lion that Wolhuter killed, along with his lovely leather belt and the brass rings in it, the original sheath and the pipe brand knife with which Wolhuter killed that lion, are on display today in the Skukuza Museum in the largest camp in the Kruger National Park. Wolhuter wrote an incredible book which many South African lads are raised on, called Memories of a Game Ranger by Harry Wolhuter. And I want to tell you that if this story stirs you in any way, and you have any interest in the remarkable formation of the Kruger Park in those early days and the life of these tough rangers to which we owe our wonderfully rich wildlife heritage, read this book, Memories of a Game Ranger by Harry Wolhuter. It is incredible in terms of its understatement. The chapter about the lion attack and him surviving is simply one of the chapters of many in this book, and Wolhuter doesn't make much of the fact that he was able to survive that lion attack and kill a lion with a knife. Do you know that some years after this event, he was lucky enough to get to Sheffield in England and visited the factory where they make the pipe brand knives? And the young man at the reception knew nothing about Harry Wolhuter, who he was. And Wolhuter was commenting on the quality of the pipe brand knife. And the young man looked rather unimpressed, and Wolhuter said, "You know, I killed a lion once with one of these." And this young man looked at him most disbelieving and said, "Yes, they're quite good for killing sheep." And he didn't know that he was talking to this iconic, heroic South African who'd survived the jaws of a lion and had killed it indeed with an original pipe brand knife. Now, they make replicas of these knives today, which are highly sought after. I would love one, and sadly I don't have one. It would be fair to say that I hope you've enjoyed this story about this remarkable South African, and that you will continue to follow me on Patreon, and I hope our paths cross again on the storytelling journey together. Thank you very much.